after Jeff Bezos decided to spike the endorsement that the Washington Post editorial board had written for the presidential campaign, the endorsement of Kamala Harris, I wrote a column respectfully dissenting from that decision. The Washington Post published it without any question. When he issued this edict about not publishing dissenting points of view, which I thought was a much more dangerous edict than the decision not to publish the presidential endorsements from here on out, I wrote a similar column, except not quite as forcefully argued. I wanted it to get published. I didn't want it to get spiked. When I was told that I couldn't write what I believed was an important thing to write, that was my moment when I knew, and I had thought this through in advance, that this would be the likely outcome. I couldn't live with myself if I hadn't tried to write that column, and I couldn't stay at the Washington Post having written that column and having it be rejected. That had never happened to me before. In my experience, a publisher of the Washington Post had never spiked a column before.
Hello and welcome to the Scientista podcast, where women in science rule. This podcast is all about supporting powerful women who lead with their brains. I'm behavioral scientist Dr. Shata Chakraborty.
And I'm former Assistant Secretary of State Monica Medina. The Scientista podcast brings you conversations with leaders, change makers, and cultural figures, sharing how they turn facts and evidence into real-world impact. So let's dive in. Today, we welcome my friend Ruth Marcus to the podcast. Ruth recently left the Washington Post, where she had been a reporter and an editor since 1984. And Ruth, I'll just dive in right here and say we've been friends for a long, long time.
Since almost
1984, yes. So I'm in the same boomer category. As a reporter, she covered the Justice Department, the Supreme Court, and the White House. And then she served as deputy national editor, supervising reporters who covered money and politics, Congress, the Supreme Court, and other important national issues. Then she joined the editorial board for a few years after that and began writing a regular column in 2006. When you left the Post last March, you did so because the Post would not publish an editorial piece that you wrote that was critical of its owner, Jeff Bezos. So we'll get into that a little bit later.
So curious to hear more about that.
I know. And you've also written a book entitled The Supreme Ambition, Brett Kavanaugh and the Conservative Takeover, about his confirmation to the Supreme Court. So welcome, Ruth. It's an honor to have you here. We're thrilled. And we want to start out the way we start every time, with your insights about how you got started. We're always hoping that the insights that people can give about their start in whatever field they're in will help others get their start. So let's talk about your childhood. You grew up in New Jersey. Your parents were scientists. And shout out to Shata, another Jersey girl. Then you went on to college at Yale, where you wrote for the paper. But after that, you decided to go to law school. So tell us about why, even after studying law at a place like Yale, you decided to become a journalist.
So first of all, thank you for having me. It's like any time with Monica is quality time. So that's really good to have. I got started in journalism really by accident. And I want to say by accident because I think it's really important for especially young people to recognize that they don't have to wake up in third grade and have some vision of what it is that they want to do in life or some passion for what they want to do in life. It's a process of discovery. And I think that our perhaps a little overstressed young people feel that it's necessary to discover that or know it way too early in life. I wandered into the Yale Daily News by accident. The truth was, which Monica will particularly appreciate, was that my mom, who Monica knows, said it would be, said this is the actual true story. I'm not sure I've ever told this publicly before, but my mother said it would be a good place to meet nice Jewish boys.
That's the truth. That's as honest as it gets.
It didn't quite work out that way from her point of view, but it did work out from my point of view, which was that I discovered, and my first published story, which was published under the byline of somebody else because I was too shy to put my own name on it.
Gosh, Ruth,
There was
that's
my
another
first
scoop.
My first byline says Roseanne Marcus. There was a woman named Roseanne Marcus at Yale. I knew enough about bylines to know that you weren't supposed to award yourself your own byline. It was about where to buy firewood for your.
Wow.
I know this is not environmentally correct. Now the fireplaces are all shut off, but then they were not. Though I did live in the only freshman dorm without fireplaces. But the process of learning about firewood, where to buy firewood, what was good firewood, what wasn't good firewood, how big a cord was just actually the introduction to me that I love journalism, which gives you the opportunity to learn stuff that you don't know anything about and to ask questions. And that actually really got me started on something that I had never considered as a career. It turned out you could get paid for doing this, as I discovered at summer internships at the Wall Street Journal when I was in college, and then after that at the Washington Star. And I ended up also by accident, kind of, at a small legal newspaper, and I got really interested in law. I decided two things: that I wanted to go to law school and that I didn't think I was probably going to practice law. And so I went off to law school knowing that I wanted to go back to journalism. I'll tell a little story about this. I went in to see Bob Woodward, who was then, this is 1981. It is 7 years after Watergate. He and Carl Bernstein have brought down a president. I go into his office at the Washington Post and he says to me, "Don't go to Harvard Law School." I turned down Harvard Law School to go work at the Montgomery Sentinel. And I gulped, and cheeky 23-year-old me said, "Well, how old were you?" And he said 26 or 27. And I said, "Great, I'll be 26 when I graduate from law school, and I'll be back." And so Bob helped me get I believe he helped me get a summer internship at the Washington Post. And the rest was not quite history, but it was my history. And that's the story of how I got started.
That's
Everybody
amazing.
should leave some space for accident, but also once you accidentally, or if not accidentally on purpose, find what it is you want to do in life, also create the conditions for pursuing it.
Oh, I love that. You're already sharing gems with us, and we're only into the first question of this podcast. Keep them coming, because this is what...
That's it. That was all my gems.
No, there's more. I know there's more.
So, okay, you're not the first lawyer on our podcast, but you are the first journalist, and I'm a scientist turned communicator. I was the first scientist that was a member of the National Press Club when I moved to Washington, D.C. At least that's what they told me, because I started using my science background to support communicating. So how do you translate science via media, broadcast media, published media? And I was so proud to have journalism as part of my newfound, once I moved to Washington, part of my newfound outputs, right? So not just research, not just teaching, but now actually writing for a broader audience. But so much has changed. That was 10, 11 years ago now, and you have a wider career that you can refer back to. We'd love to hear from you. How has journalism changed over the course of your career? I've seen so much change just in the last few years. What do you think is better now, and what do you think is more regrettable in the state of our media?
Okay, so better first. What we do, we can be so much more, as with the rest of the world and the rest of the workforce, we can be so much more productive in what we do. I think I want to do this in my old lady voice. When I started back in the day.
Have an old lady voice. If anybody can, move at the speed of sound and be fast, it's you, even before ChatGPT.
ChatGPT has not entered my work life, but when I started, we literally typed on typewriters. I remember we typed on typewriters, and I happened to have, this was not brought as a prop, but we literally cut and paste. I remember at the Yale Daily News, my editor...
so she's showing scissors for the audience that's just listening.
Sorry about that. Cutting apart my stories and pasting them back together in the right order. I typed on typewriters at my first job out of college. And in the olden days, it was harder to reach people and find people. If you wanted a copy of a bill, you actually got up off your butt, went down to the Capitol, went to the clerk of the House or Senate, and got a copy of the legislation. If you wanted to see campaign finance records, you went down and you looked at the microfiche at the Federal Election Commission. And finally, your capacity not just to do your work, but to have your work seen was so much more limited then. You were limited by the length that you could write on the physical page, and you were limited in the audience you could have, that because the only way that they could receive your work was on the physical page. And so unless the physical Washington Post was sent to various jurisdictions, you couldn't read it. Or, eventually, I guess, maybe there was a way to get it through Nexus or something. So there are many ways.
A lot for
yes,
it then. Yeah.
But there are many ways in which I can be so much more productive at my job. I can read court opinions at the click of a button that I used to have to. I remember refusing to write about court opinions unless I could get them faxed to me, and that was a highfalutin new technology. So that's some, probably not all, of the good stuff in terms of the change in our mutual profession. The bad is obvious. Our financial model has collapsed. It is continuing to collapse all around us. As you mentioned, ChatGPT, clearly AI is not affecting the way I do my job, but it's certainly affecting the business climate of doing my job because search is changing, and people will not use, if people don't use search, then we don't get traffic, and et cetera. And so the disruption of the business model and the simultaneous and probably related splintering of the media landscape into partisan ideological silos has been a really terrible development. I like to write for a broad audience. I am not interested in preaching to the converted, though I'm happy if the already, converted are reading the columns that I write and agreeing with them. It means much more to me if somebody who would tend to disagree with me reads it and says, "You made me think.
Right.
You made me reconsider. Every once in a while, you made me change my mind." That is less and less true as people are able to migrate only to news organizations, and they choose to do this. So, I'm a believer in choice of all sorts. But as people are able to migrate to news organizations that only amplify and reinforce their pre-existing views, then they aren't able to, don't put themselves in the position to see views that disagree with theirs. One of the best moments of my day is reading the Wall Street Journal editorial page, with which I disagree much more than I agree, but it makes me think much more than, honestly, editorial pages that share my point of view.
Sure.
And that actually is, and we'll get to this at some point, very much related to my reasons for leaving the Washington Post.
Wow. Well, I think it is what's challenging about this landscape now, not only for journalists, but also for the audience. At Scientista, we have founded this podcast on the notion that facts and data, that truth is so important. And that's something that I think scientists and journalists share, that desire to bring the truth forward. But it's hard in this continual sort of avalanche of information. Those two things, facts and data, are harder and harder to discern amid everything that is being thrown at people, particularly through algorithms that they can't even see or control. So what do you think about all of this kind of facts and data and news posing, opinion sort of stilted facts and data? What do you think about the blurring of those lines? And do you think it's possible to get back to some sense of a shared sense of facts and reality?
So I am a big believer in what, at the Washington Post, we call the separation of church and state. I think news and opinion should be separate from each other. I am a kind of fuddy-duddy, old-fashioned believer that there's too much opinion in the news section. But that doesn't mean the opposite is not true. There can never be enough fact in the opinion section. And what I mean by that is I can go to high C and scream from the rooftops my belief that Donald Trump is a threat to the rule of law. Or I can give you facts and analysis to support my belief. And I think that facts are much more compelling than argumentation devoid of facts is much less compelling than argumentation supported by facts. You can tell me about what a scientific truth is, but I want you as a reader and a consumer to show me the research. And I think that the best opinion writing is opinion writing that is supplemented and based on factual findings, whatever they may be. We're now in this world of alternative facts.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kellyanne Conway.
Kellyanne Conway. That was my original draft of the question. Alternative facts. It's just such a mind-blowing thing.
And competing facts, and not just alternative facts, but invented facts, hallucinated facts. Thank you, ChatGPT. And intentionally misinformed and disinformed facts. And that is something that you need to, I think, guard against by making sure that you go to news sources that have standards and processes in place to make certain that as best they can, they don't get by the whatever exists of the, in this economic climate, the fact-checking process. I mean, one of the astonishing stories of the last couple of weeks was that a few very prominent national newspapers apparently printed a list of recommended books for summer readings that included non-existent books were made up by one of them. I'm not going to blame ChatGPT. I don't know which AI it was. It's not that the AI made up these books. It said newspapers printed these lists of books, and that should all scare the bejesus out of all of us.
Because they're just not checking.
They're just not checking.
Last few questions for you. Thank you so much for your time. This has been super fascinating. So much to learn. I know our audience appreciates it too. For those scientistas that are looking at careers in journalism or just careers that involve heavy writing, from legal briefs to reports to even movie scripts or recipes, you were saying how ChatGPT hasn't come into your career, but what do you think about writing as a skill for going forward and for future careers? Do you think it's important to be a good writer in the future of AI? Is it going to be needed?
So look, how could somebody who has spent her entire career writing say writing isn't important, or we can outsource writing to an AI and it will do a bang up job, and so that skill isn't critical? I think writing remains a critical skill even in the age of AI and despite its existence. And I know it can be really helpful for sort of standard things, that it doesn't really matter if it's great writing as long as it's adequate writing and it can get it done quickly. But the process of writing is the process of thinking. Judges have this phrase that the opinion just wouldn't write. Once you sit down and start thinking about something, you realize there's a flaw in your logic. So if you don't take the time to write, and by the way, I actually think that our kids who grew up writing on keyboards confuse typing with writing sometimes, and that sometimes I don't do this, but if you slow down and think it through, if you slow down and write something on paper, you are disciplining your mind to think more slowly and therefore more critically and therefore more deeply and therefore more effectively. If we outsource the writing, we're outsourcing the thinking, and that is just outsourcing. It's not our humanity, but it's our intelligence, and we just have given that up. And so there is no skill, even in this age, that is more critical than the ability to write well, because the ability to write well presupposes the ability to think clearly.
We know how important critical thinking is.
Yes.
I think everybody can agree on that.
Scientistas everywhere. That's what we're for. So, Ruth, let me ask you our final question. And I want to start by saying, if you love Ruth's writing, which is fantastic, you can find her now in The New Yorker pretty regularly, I'd say, because she's a prolific writer.
I can't stop.
Which is great. Keep going. But, we talked about this earlier in the podcast, that you left the Washington Post because your bosses refused to publish a column that you wrote that was critical of the CEO. Now that you've had a couple of months to reflect on that, do you have any regrets? And what advice would you give to scientistas who might find themselves in a very similar situation where you kind of get thrown a curveball, or you have to get past a really bad roadblock in your career? What advice do you have for anyone facing what you've faced in the last couple of months, which is difficult?
So I'm going to try to do this in a truncated way. The short version of the advice that I would give is, don't act precipitously. Don't do anything in anger or in haste. Stop and think about, is this important? How important is this moment? Can you live with yourself if you don't stand up in this moment? What is the consequence for you and your family if you leave your job? That's totally legitimate to think about. What's the consequence for the greater good? Not to be too megalomaniacal about it if you leave the job. I am very sorry to have left the Washington Post after 40 years, 6 months, and 6 days, because I miss the audience that the Washington Post gave me and the ability to reach all of these people. I decided that I needed to leave because I disagreed with Jeff Bezos' decision to limit the opinion section to 2 main pillars, free markets and individual liberties. I believe in both of those things, by the way.
You've written about them. That's so much of your career. And
not to publish views that he said dissented from that. My view is, and I had thought Jeff Bezos' view was, dissenting views are the best way to help people reason their own way to what is the right outcome. You can read an argument on one side, you can read an argument on the other side. I have always believed that readers who take the time to read things are then smart enough to figure out for themselves which argument they find more persuasive. After Jeff Bezos decided to spike the endorsement that the Washington Post editorial board had written for the presidential campaign, the endorsement of Kamala Harris, I wrote a column respectfully dissenting from that decision. The Washington Post published it without any question. When he issued this edict about not publishing dissenting points of view, which I thought was a much more dangerous edict than the decision not to publish the presidential endorsements from here on out, I wrote a similar column, except not quite as forcefully argued. I wanted it to get published. I didn't want it to get spiked. When I was told that I couldn't write what I believed was an important thing to write, that was my moment when I knew, and I had thought this through in advance, that this would be the likely outcome. I couldn't live with myself if I hadn't tried to write that column, and I couldn't stay at the Washington Post having written that column and having it be rejected. That had never happened to me before. In my experience, a publisher of the Washington Post had never spiked a column before, and this was not ever. And this wasn't a paper, as much as I love it and continue to love it, that I could work for, because I could not assure my readers that I was being allowed to write what I believed.
And that's the essence of the opinion page. Good for you.
And that, but it took me a lot of thinking to get to know that it was right for me to try to write that column, because I couldn't look at myself in the mirror if I didn't try to write it. And it was right for me to leave. That was not a hard choice, really. I mean, it was a painful choice, but it wasn't a hard one when they said, we won't run this.
Well, Ruth, your columns in the Post you can find them all still online, and your books and books and books of columns will stand the test of time. I know they will, and they'll be a testament to your work. And now we have more to look forward to, because you'll still be writing now for other publications like The New Yorker, and thank them for taking on your work, because it's great to be able to find it in print and online still. So thank you very much for all the time you've given us today. You've made a great podcast for us. I know the advice will be really taken to heart by our listeners. And if you liked this podcast, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed it, please help others discover it by leaving us a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and tell a friend. We need more people listening to this podcast. That's the way we're really going to have an impact ourselves. We appreciate all your support.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much,
pleasure.
Ruth, for joining us. And please find us on scientista.world for more stories, updates, and ways to get involved. Thank you for listening.